I have known my husband since high school. We were friends for the longest time before we started to date, which eventually led to our marriage. My mother-in-law has always been a precise person. Things needed to be perfect for her to be happy. If something looked off to her in the slightest, she had to fix it immediately. The only time she ever relaxed was when she was drunk, which happened seldom. That was her first mistake. Last Thursday, my mother-in-law sent out a message in the family group chat on my husband's side. She was hosting a gathering that Saturday at 6 p.m. sharp. Her message was formal and typed out carefully. Quite the opposite of how I write. That wasn't the only way of living we didn't share. I'm a very laid-back person. I do things because I want to do them, not because other people think I should do them. I don't let others influence my lifestyle either. My mother-in-law sure has tried to, though. She seems to think that since she's made everyone else in the family perfect, she can do the same with me, too. Nope. No one in our family is actually perfect, though. They only pretend to be in order to appease the beast. I won't be pressured into being somebody I'm not, no matter how much I'm nagged about it. But the nagging had stopped recently. The one time I went over to her house before the party, my mother-in-law didn't make a snarky comment about me once. We even had a conversation over tea. Maybe this could be a turning point in our relationship, I thought. It wasn't. I never would have noticed something was off. My mother-in-law greeted the family in her stiff, curt manner. The house was spotless when we stepped inside, as per usual. As soon as they settled, the guests began to drink. Nothing too heavy, though. Mother-in-law would be upset if anyone misbehaved when it came time to eat. To most of our surprise, she poured herself a glass of wine when she sat down with us. My husband, who sat on the sofa beside me, whispered that he had only seen his mother drink 4 times in his entire life. It was odd, but I didn't look too deep into it. She probably was just nervous about the party, with the constant tapping of her foot to the floor. When dinner time came around, my mother-in-law was full-on drunk. She slurred her words as she announced the meal she had prepared. Turkey, sausage, roasted peppers, mashed potatoes, and homemade gravy. It looked delicious. I scooped up portions of each onto my plate and made a quick escape to the kitchen to wash my hands. I didn't even notice the vial my mother-in-law was holding as I passed her. When I came back and we all sat down at the dinner table, my plate was right where I left it, except I noticed something different. I never, ever put gravy on my potatoes. So who did? Whatever. I'll just get a new portion and give the other to someone else. I headed back into the kitchen and was surprised to see that all the potatoes had been taken. Come to think of it, my mother-in-law hadn't even baked a huge amount of mashed potatoes in the first place. I'll just switch with whoever in the family liked gravy and had a similar plate of food to mine. Everyone had already started eating when I got back, however. The only person who wasn't at the table was, you guessed it, my husband's mother. She was occupied trying to calm down one of her wailing grandchildren and failing miserably. With so much on her hands, as well as the alcohol in her system, she didn't even notice that I took her plate of food and replaced it with mine. Dinner was great. I had no idea I'd just narrowly escaped death, though. My mother-in-law was quiet the entire time we said goodbyes, half-assing every hug that she was given. My husband is the type of person to take years to say his goodbyes, so I sat back down on the couch and waited for him to finish. I only really gave goodbyes to the people I knew well, my husband's 2 cousins and aunt. I had known them since they surprised my husband with a visit while I was hanging out with him all those years ago. I almost jumped out of my skin when I felt a hand touch my bare shoulder. It was my mother-in-law, looking panicked. She asked me if I had had gravy on my mashed potatoes, and I responded truthfully. Her eyes went wide, and she looked like she was about to cry. I didn't have the chance to interrogate her because my husband was calling for me. We finally left the house and were headed back to our own place. Although I do love a good get-together, that night was exhausting. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, though. I ignored it for the next couple of days, focusing only on work and keeping the house clean, until one day I came home to my husband sitting on the couch in tears. His mother had passed away from some sort of unknown poisoning, and that's how I got here, typing out my little story the night before my mother-in-law's funeral, while my husband sleeps peacefully next to me. He hasn't gotten a proper rest since she passed. Mourning and planning the funeral did a number on him. I trust my husband, and I know he trusts me too, but if I told him what I thought was planned to happen that night, he wouldn't believe me. He would probably hate me for even thinking his mother would try to hurt me. She's never done it before, so why now? I've been trying to tell myself this, but I just can't believe it. If she was innocent, why did she drink an abnormal amount of alcohol? Why did she slather gravy on my potatoes when she knew I would need it? And why would she ask me about it right before we left? This has to be a mistake. It just has to. It must all just be a coincidence. But I can't let it go. I'm such a terrible person for thinking my mother-in-law tried to poison me. Or is she the terrible person? I'll tell you, I just don't even know anymore. I really do love my husband. He's a great guy who's been with me since my high school days, and he's always been supportive of my dreams and hobbies. He's got a great sense of humor and is wonderful with kids. Well, if we have any someday. The one thing I haven't been able to understand, much less tolerate, is his dad. Don't get me wrong, his family is eccentric to say the least. They do normal family things on the weekends except Saturday nights, which is exclusively for my husband and his father. I've never been allowed to attend these gatherings of theirs, but I don't question it since I respect my husband's space with his dad. Lately, however, I have been getting phone calls. They started as your normal phone calls, the typical father-in-law check-ins, if you will. Hi Jenna, it's Sean. Just wanted to see how your day was. Tell Jeremy to call me when he gets a chance. Not every day, just some days he would call. Last week, though, I haven't been able to shake the voicemail I received from him. Something wasn't right with him. Jenna? Oh, Jenna, still echoes in my ears along with the come out, wherever you are, which was left on more than one voicemail. It's just one of his pranks, my husband told me, but something didn't feel right. The calls only became more frequent after that. The voicemails flooded my phone. If it wasn't labored breathing he left behind, it was horrendous laughter. If it wasn't a sing-songy reinvention of my name, it was asking me to answer his calls. What really drew the line for me was this week. I arrived home late from work one night, pulling into my driveway in the darkness when my phone rang. This scared me within my own car because my phone was dead seconds before. Well, maybe I overlooked it. Maybe I misread the percentage of the battery. The phone was ringing. The chimes reverberated off the walls of my car. It was my father-in-law. I didn't want to answer, so I slid the call to voicemail. I couldn't even get out of the car before he had left behind a message, so I listened out of curiosity. Maybe it was an emergency. Jenna, why won't you get out of the car? He had said in a whiny voice. Why won't you come inside? I've been waiting for you. The voicemail ended, leaving me in the car alone. I frantically looked outside my car. Nobody was watching me, so I went ahead and stepped out so I could head inside. I only made it so far up the sidewalk to my house before I noticed the upstairs bedroom light was on and a figure standing in the window. husband was not home at that time, since it was Saturday, and he was with his dad on these nights. But when I looked even closer, I was horrified and confused. The figure appeared to be my father-in-law, except his eyes were bulging and his smile was wide. I could see the whites of his eyes and his discolored teeth from where I was standing. So I did what any sane person would do. I reached for my phone to call the police, my husband, anybody, but my phone was dead, after all. When I looked back at the man standing in my window, his head tilted, keeping that wide and haunting smile. Slowly, he raised his hand and wiggled his fingers in a wave at me before turning and walking away from the window. He never broke that smile and seemed to float when he walked. The bedroom light clicked off shortly after he left my sight. This all had me scared beyond my mind, so I drove to my sister's house for the night. But even then, the voicemails didn't stop. "Why did you leave, Jenna? We wanted to welcome you home." Delete. "Come home, Jenna. I promise we don't bite." Delete. "I know you're hiding, Jenna, but I'll always find you." Delete. My phone rang consistently the entire night, with voicemail after voicemail being left by my father-in-law. The only time I ever touched my phone was to text my husband that I would need to speak with him in the morning, and I did. Once I had gathered the courage to head home, my husband was there, waiting and wondering. I didn't have any other explanation for my weird behavior or avoidance of his family the past few weeks, so I sat him down and explained everything to him. That doesn't sound like my dad would do that. He was persistent on that, and I don't blame him. It's his dad. But there was no other way to convince him, so I pulled out my phone to play the audio messages for him. There were no voicemails in my inbox. There were no missed calls in my call log. If you don't want to come to family gatherings, that's fine, hun, but just say that next time, okay? And with that, he got up from the table and left. I thought briefly for a moment that I was losing my mind, but every time I shut my eyes, all I can see was that face, the face of my father-in-law, the haunting smile, the slow turn away from the window and into the rest of my house. I knew what I had seen. I had to write this all down before I forgot, or before I chose to forget, or, God forbid, something happens to me. And even as I write this, he is still calling. The phone is ringing and ringing and ringing. My husband and I live on a sprawling property on the outskirts of Washington. Nestled at the center of the 4 acres of our own personal forest is a charming cabin-style home he inherited from his grandparents. We moved there fairly recently and are happily settling in. It was a much-needed change of pace from our life in the city, which seemed ages ago. After I became pregnant 5 months ago, we decided we should leave our smog-ridden condo and move to his newly inherited land. He was able to transfer hospitals due to him being a renowned surgeon, and I decided to leave my work as a paralegal and focus on the baby. I truly enjoyed waking up in the mornings to the fresh air and the chorus of birds chirping. For my husband, it was a return back to his life before I met him in college. Interestingly enough, we never really spoke of his childhood. He told me a few snippets, but overall nowhere near what I have shared with him of mine. I learned that for the most part he grew up with his grandparents in Washington, and he loved growing alongside the nature that surrounded him. He said he never knew his father, and his mother would often be away, so they did not develop a strong relationship, which is why I found it strange when he suddenly told me she was visiting. I had met her briefly at our small mountaintop wedding, but today she would be spending the night. It did not help the fact that when I did meet her at the wedding, she barely let out more than a grunt to any of the guests. a huge contrast from my boisterous parents, which normally I wouldn't mind, but I still felt I wasn't familiar enough with this woman to let her spend the night. Not to mention, when my husband told me that his mother would be coming over, I felt that there was an uneasiness in his voice. Regardless, this person is his mother, and I should become familiar with her before she is to meet the baby once he is born. She arrived later that evening with a rapid knock at the front door. My husband's eyes went round as he jumped up to answer the door. As she walked in, I instantly recognized her. She looked exactly the same as when I met her 3 years ago. She was a fairly short woman, just a smidge over 5 feet, with a portly frame. She also wore a short bob haircut, tortoise-shell glasses, and an unshapely dress. Overall, she seemed like your local kindergarten teacher. My husband gave her a brief hug and addressed her as mother. For me, I put on my cheeriest voice and exclaimed how excited I was to see her again. The mother showed a smile that was closer to a grimace. Still, I soldiered on with my cheerful attitude. Due to the late time at which she arrived, we agreed to have dinner and then go to bed. Luckily, I had already prepared the pot roast in the oven. I attempted to make conversation once we were at the table, but I was met with a sharp look from the mother. My husband explained that his mother believes talking during dinner is extremely poor in taste and a distraction from the food. We ate in silence. I couldn't help but study her as she ate. She was clearly focused solely on what was on her plate. For a minute, she simply stared intently at her food. Suddenly, she began to tear at the roast with her bare hands. I felt my eyebrows raise and looked to my husband, but he was attempting to occupy himself with his own food. When I looked back to the mother again, she was halfway finished with her food. The juice from the meat ran down her mouth in rivers, and she was grunting happily. It took all of my effort not to gag, and even more to eat just a forkful of food. Once she had finished, she quickly announced she was going to bed. Once my husband and I got settled into our own bed, I asked him what was going on. He let out a long sigh and said he would tell me in the morning. But for now, he really just wanted to sleep. Knowing better than to argue, I went to sleep as well. I was awoken in the middle of the night to the sharp sound of a phone ringing. In the darkness, I heard my husband rummaging around his nightstand. He answered, and next thing I knew, he told me he had to leave. He was needed at the hospital for an emergency surgery. In moments, he had thrown on clothes and was giving me a kiss, signaling his departure. Right before he left the bedroom, though, he turned back to me and told me to please stay in the bedroom and wait for him to come back. I found it odd he would tell me such a thing, but I was much too tired to give it any real thought. Gradually, I was drifting off to sleep once more. I was woken up a second time that night. At first, I had hoped it was my husband returning home, but I quickly realized that was not the case. There were rhythmic thuds coming from somewhere in the house. Not long after, the silence between thuds was replaced with low mutterings. I could not make out the words, but it was definitely coming from a woman. I laid paralyzed by fear in my bed. I could hear my breath become shallow and beads of sweat began to form all over my body. I kept looking at the bedroom clock to see how much time had passed. After 6 minutes, both the mutters and the thuds had stopped. Suddenly, I heard rapid steps coming from one of the bedrooms, but the pacing was off. It was too quick to come from someone that was walking on 2 feet. Again, for 6 minutes, the pacing continued from room to room. At times, it even sounded like it was coming from on top of the roof. Eventually, I heard them coming closer to my own bedroom. Soon, the pacing had stopped directly in front of my door. I was now able to hear the labored breathing of whatever lay beyond the bedroom door. The muttering also resumed. It was some sort of chant, but the only word I could make out was child. Long scratching along the length of the door began to accompany the muttering. I began to think of my baby and how I had to protect him. It was then that my mind shifted to how I needed to escape, but first I needed to lock the bedroom door. In one motion, I exited the bed and ran to the door to lock it. As my fingers touched the doorknob, the horrific scratches turned into thunderous bangs. The soft, incessant muttering became ear-piercing shrieks. Fear began to grip me so tightly that I felt lightheaded from my own ragged breathing, and my nightgown was now soaked with sweat. I let out a frustrated sob. It was then that I realized I had left my phone in the kitchen. I had no choice but to try to escape from the feral creature. Luckily, my bedroom was located on the first floor. It seemed my only way of exit was to climb out of our large windows and navigate through the dark back to the road. It was an insane idea, but I could not stand to be in the house any longer with this thing in my house. I swept open the curtains and gazed out into the forest. The sky was cloudless, and moonlight shone through the trees and illuminated the forest in an eerie glow. A dense fog also formed along the forest floor. Determined, I motioned to unlock the latches on the window. At once, the shrieking and banging stopped. Hesitation paralyzed my body, but I shook it off. I unlatched one of the locks. Deftly, I went to the second and final lock, but I caught something in my peripheral vision. I slowly shifted my gaze, terrified at what I might see. Mere inches from the window was the mother. Her short haircut had become matted and wild. Her dress was torn all over, exposing loose, saggy skin underneath. Her chest heaved like she was on the verge of collapse, but by far the worst thing was her face. She wore a toothy, demented grin. I had not realized how sharp her teeth were. They were closer to an animal than to a lady well into her 60s. Her face was shiny with perspiration, and somehow she had gotten deep scratches all over her face. The last thing was her eyes. Her eyes were frightfully wide and constantly rolling in her head. Every few moments they would land on me, but would swiftly resume their constant vigil of her surroundings. She looked nothing like the lady I had met earlier. This thing wasn't human. The mother raised a gnarled, bloodied hand and began to tap on the glass, as if she was trying to lure out a frightened rabbit. All I could do was stand there, petrified. I dared not to open the last latch as she was waiting there. Slowly, her head began to tilt clockwise. I swear I could hear her bones and muscles strain as her head continued to turn, her eyes now hyper-focused on my own. By the time she had completed a full turn, I was utterly and completely racked by fear. I sat down on the bed, hopeless. Mercifully, I heard a car's engine in the distance, coming closer and closer. It was my husband, finally returning from the hospital. Overwhelmingly, joy swelled in my chest. The mother had also heard the noise, and with one leap, she scrambled on top of the roof. I made sure to wait for him, never leaving the bedroom.